Well, let's take a look at one of our top stories tonight. This is apropos. Well, Lebanon says it's filing a complaint to the UN Security Council over Israeli attacks as fighting claims more casualties on both sides. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his country would extend a buffer zone inside Lebanese territory against Hezbollah militants, stoking fears of an Israeli military occupation that could deepen instability and displace even more people. France 24's Selena Sykes has the latest for us.
In this footage released by the Israel Defense Forces, airstrikes hit an alleged Hezbollah command center and a weapons depot in southern Lebanon. Since Israel intensified its offensive against the Iran-backed group, the destruction on the ground has been devastating. The streets of Nabatea have been reduced to rubble. The city, usually home to around 40,000 people, is virtually deserted. Ali is one of only a few residents to have ignored Israel's evacuation orders.
Several generations were born into war, and we will continue in war. This is our land, and we will remain here.
On top of airstrikes, Israel has moved several thousand soldiers into southern Lebanon in recent weeks, in what it says is a defensive move to protect its northern border communities. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said Israel will expand a buffer zone in the south, sparking fears that Israel is preparing for a large-scale ground invasion in Lebanon. The UN has expressed their alarm over the deteriorating humanitarian crisis, with more than 1,000 people killed and more than 1 million displaced since the war began at the beginning of March.
Hezbollah must stop launching attacks into Israel, and Israel must stop its military operations and strikes in Lebanon, which are hitting civilians the hardest.
On Wednesday, Hezbollah's leader Naim Qassem said any negotiations with Israel while under bombardment would amount to surrender. Tehran, for its part, reportedly wants Lebanon to be included in any ceasefire deal brokered with the US and has demanded that Israel stops its offensive against Hezbollah.
Well, let's get some analysis on the situation in Lebanon now. And for that, we have Nadim Houry joining us. He's the Executive Director of Arab Reform Initiative. Nadim, great to have you with us. Welcome to the program. So we heard in that report just there that, Tehran wants Lebanon to be included in any ceasefire deal brokered with the US. But how realistic is the scenario of an eventual ceasefire by both sides? I mean, it's looking unlikely in the near term, and signs are pointing more towards a protracted conflict.
Well, this is what, Israel wants a protracted conflict, and they're approaching the situation in Lebanon through occupation to create a buffer zone, possibly annexation, which is what we saw in Gaza with what they call the Yellow Line, and what we saw last year in Syria, where Israel invaded even larger parts of the country. Hezbollah with Iran are pushing probably to go back to the status quo after the 2006 war, where there was a ceasefire which allowed Hezbollah to remain powerful in the south. Now, in the middle of all of this, you have the Lebanese government with large backing, which is actually trying to get to a ceasefire and return to the 1949 armistice agreement, which would see the Lebanese army deploy. But Israel so far has not shown any interest in the Lebanese offer, really unprecedented, of having direct negotiations.
So the Israeli military says, it sent another division into Lebanon, expanding effectively its operation against Hezbollah. As things currently stand, there are very few signs that either side is willing to back down.
Yeah, let's just, Israel is no longer waging a war against Hezbollah only. It's actually waging a war against Lebanon. You have a quarter of the population, over 1,200,000 people, who've been displaced in less than 3 weeks. Israel has attacked, and we're just seeing footage, ambulances, they've destroyed bridges, they actually even killed some Lebanese army soldiers. So at this point, this is not just some sort of operation between Israel and Hezbollah. And Israel, in my view, is repeating a historical and strategic mistake, which it already did in 1978 and did again in 1982 up until 2000, which is thinking that with sheer force, land occupation, they can somehow, secure their border and not take into account legitimate Lebanese demands. The better outcome, in my view, is a going back to state-to-state negotiations, go back to the process of disarming Hezbollah by the Lebanese army, which started after the ceasefire in November 2024, and was showing some signs of success. Slow success, definitely, but you can't disarm a group like Hezbollah, which really has been rooted in Lebanon for more than 40 years overnight. But yes, I mean, the fear is that that Israel will not just occupy temporarily, but is looking into a buffer zone that could turn into annexation and occupation, particularly given the statements by many Israeli ministers, where they're openly talking about settling parts of southern Lebanon, which would really be, in addition to being completely illegal, a recipe for forever wars, because the Lebanese will resist, and it might be a Hezbollah 2.0, or it will be other forms, but the Lebanese are not going to give up their attachment to their land.
So Nadim, you mentioned just there that you mentioned disarming Hezbollah, but there are some who actually believe that doing so would leave the country even more exposed given the weakness of the Lebanese army. What do you say to that?
Sure. I mean, look, Lebanon is divided, and there's a real question which has really been at the heart of, in a way, the Lebanese dilemma for 40, 50 years. How do you protect yourself from Israel, particularly given the weak state of the Lebanese army, which is in large part as well due to the fact that no outside power has been willing to arm the Lebanese army to be able to defend itself. Lebanon has no air defense system, for instance. And that's been on purpose. I think today there is a large majority of Lebanese. There's no unanimity in any country, but there's a large majority of Lebanese, and there's a decision by the legitimate government, the president, which got the vote of parliament, to say Lebanon no longer wants to tolerate arms outside the monopoly of the state, which is natural. I mean, otherwise you cannot talk about sovereignty. And that Lebanon wants to try a new model to go back to the way things were between Lebanon and Israel between 1949 up until the 1960s, which is state to state, not a normalization, but actually an armistice, which would keep the Lebanese safe and keep the Israelis safe. That, in my view, is today the most promising and, frankly, the only sustainable way to have stability along this border. Everything else has been tried. Israel has invaded Lebanon multiple times, occupied it, created, the South Lebanon Army, which was a proxy for Israel. They occupied it themselves directly. None of that worked. And for them to think that this time will be different, frankly, defies the imagination. And the cost this time is enormous. I mean, they are applying Gaza-style tactics. They're not just targeting, particular Hezbollah fighters or weapons caches. They're going into villages and they're literally detonating entire homes, entire neighborhoods, mosques, basically the entire civilian infrastructure. They've already destroyed most bridges over the Litani Bridge. And this will take Lebanon years to rebuild, Lebanon, which was already bankrupt. And for what?
So just continuing on what you said about, this triangle, if you will, between Israel, the Lebanese government, and Hezbollah, we see this increasing gap between the Lebanese government and, the group Hezbollah. What are the long-term consequences of this chasm? I mean, even after this conflict between Hezbollah and Israel comes to an end, Lebanon is likely to face a very divided political and social scenario.
That's true. But this is a process that's been going on for a long time. In a way, for many Lebanese, the fact that Hezbollah retained its weapons was seen as legitimate up until they managed to liberate the South after 2000. And since then, that has been a source of tension internally because Hezbollah was not simply defending the border, but They used the weapons internally in 2008 against other Lebanese political groups that they disagreed with. They decided to intervene to support Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, even though most Lebanese were opposed to that. They were supporting Houthi groups and so forth. And the decision has been taken. It's been taken democratically. It's been taken in a government where actually Hezbollah had two members in that government. So yes, it's not a unanimous decision, but there's a clear majority. By some opinion polls, it was about 80% of the Lebanese want to see a monopoly of arms at the hands of the Lebanese state. That doesn't answer the more profound question, which is, can this Lebanese state defend itself and ensure its sovereignty? Now, Lebanon is starting from, a position of weakness, and that's why it needs support to rebuild its army. The process actually requires international pressure. For it to succeed, it would require international pressure to have Israel stop violations, because what we're not talking about is that during the last ceasefire that was signed in November 2024, Israel violated, according to the UN, 10,000 times the ceasefire in less than 2 years. So, the Lebanese army and the Lebanese state needs some time, needs some support, needs some space to be able to do this very delicate issue of disarming Hezbollah, while at the same time building a national defense framework that can protect the country. I don't think Lebanon has any pretense or desire to be an aggressive or hostile country, but it needs for its sovereignty to develop a national defense strategy, and Israel is simply not giving it that time.
Nadim, we're going to have to leave it there, but very interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
You're watching World Roundup. Stay with us. More news to come after the break.